Okay, the first thing is the basic measures of type. Of these, points and M, I think, are the two key ones that you'll want to know. I'm going to go through all of them. So points are a typographic unit of measure or size, very commonly used to describe size of type. And we also describe the size and degree of spacing between lines, which is also called leading, in points. So here, this paragraph of type, the size of the type is 14 points and the leading is 22 points, and that's expressed by writing 14 over 22 points. A pica contains 12 points, and picas are typically used to represent fixed horizontal measurements. So really for things like column width. I, as a book designer, don't actually use picas. I use millimeters or inches. And I also look at the number of words I have on a line. Those are the things I look at. I don't tend to work in picas. And the only people I know who do work in picas work at an organization in which other people use the picas. So I'm not really that concerned, for example, if students in my classes work in picas or not. An M is a flexible unit of measurement. It's different than something consistent like an inch because it's a proportional measurement, similar to X height in a way. So an M is equal to the height of the type size being used. And I'll just add in there, I think it's a slightly fudgeable size. I'm not sure if type designers would agree with me, but an M dash, for example, which is supposedly the width of an M, sometimes seems to me a little bit smaller or larger than an M in the type that it's set in. You can kind of keep an eye on that yourself. Anyway, the key thing there is that an M is a flexible unit of measuring type in which the width is equal to the height of the type size being used. So if I was to take this type and make it 16 points, the M measurement in it would change. And an EN, is approximately half of an M. So as I mentioned, one of the things we think about in typesetting is the space between the lines of type, and that is often referred to as leading. So this paragraph up top has tighter leading than this paragraph below. Tracking is the adjusting of the spacing between letters in a word or in a line of type. So for example, I could track out this word or I could track out this whole line. At the top here, you see type that's quite tightly tracked, and at the bottom, this is type that is quite loosely tracked. I would also describe this as being tracked out. Paragraph breaks, which I'm going to talk in a moment, are really key if you're setting blocks of type, because they let the person reading it know that there's a new paragraph that they're reading. If you're typesetting on a default setting and you get to the end of a line, say for example you get to the end of weary arms, and you press the return key twice, you get quite a large amount of space between the paragraphs. Once you begin setting type, one of the things you'll do is control the amount of space between paragraphs in order to create a layout that is comfortable to read. And that's partly at your discretion. There's not a scientific formula for that. But here you see a paragraph break that is controlled. It's not a double space. And I will show you in the next slide how to do that. So these are settings. I put a screenshot here so that you can pause this and set up the settings in a paragraph style if you want to. I will be recording a separate, very short tutorial showing how to make paragraph breaks. That's something that new typesetters are often struggling with a little bit. So if you are in a class of mine, you will be receiving a short tutorial to reference. My cat's cleaning himself next to the microphone. I'm not sure if the microphone's picking it up or not. Okay, so in InDesign, you can create a paragraph style which allows you to control the amount of space between paragraphs. And that's something that you should be always doing when you're typesetting. You shouldn't leave that as default. Similarly, you don't want to leave your type size at default. Default type size in Adobe products is usually 12 point over 14.4 point leading. So don't leave that as a default. You should always be making choices about that. Okay, so again, check the other tutorial if you need more assistance on that. Monospacing is when you type has evenly spaced characters, it's really made for computer recognition. It's not made to be comfortable for a human reader to read optically. Some people choose monospace options because they enjoy the aesthetic of it. It's not something I would generally use for long form text unless I was specifically making some sort of reference to computers or something like that. Kerning is the adjustment of space between glyphs in which you're going for optical consistency. So optical consistency is really, really important in typesetting. It's not something that you can, take a ruler and measure. So when I was first learning how to adjust type, I didn't know that, and I would go in and I would actually measure spaces and try and make them all even, and that's exactly the opposite of what you want to do. You want to make it look like each letter form is comfortably and consistently spaced. And of course, negative spaces in letters complicate that. So for example, if you have a letter T, it has this negative space, and so you'll have to think about how to adjust glyphs near it. Now, in this particular set of words here, this is a title, and by the way, titles are usually the only thing you kern. There are exceptions to that rule, like sometimes I have to go through a large amount of text and kern certain numbers if they're setting loose or something, but usually it's just for things like titles, display. This here that says the wind in the willows is default italic. And where you see this TH actually is a ligature. These two letters are actually a single glyph, and the font has included this partly to get around the fact that T's can set kind of awkwardly and that T's and H's are often used together. As you can see, it has an unintended effect of letting the H and E appear loose, and that's exactly the kind of thing that you would go in and fix. So if you want to even just pause this for a moment and check yourself to see where you think letters might need to be adjusted, pairings of letters, you can do that, and then I will point them out. Okay, so this is loose, and here again, this is loose. I would say that this is a little bit loose. And as somebody pointed out in our class session, if you're in my most recent class, this negative space in between the W and the I is also awkward. So these require two different types of approach. Let's start with these loose spacings between the letter forms. These are actually loose. You can see that there is just a lot of negative space. So you would go in and you place your cursor in between those two letter forms, and you would kern them negatively to tighten them up. So that's how you would deal with that. Every once in a while you might go in and loosen something up. The point is that you're trying to be consistent. This negative space here is different because you can see if I was to tighten up this pair of letter forms, the W is going to crash into the I. They're going to crash into each other and it won't look good. So that's where you need to make a decision. Either you might decide that italics are not ideal for this, but if you like italics, like I think the italic looks windy and willowy, so I think an italic works. If you want to use the italic, you could do what I've done here, which is to look for a set that has an alternate glyph for the uppercase W. So what you see here is an alternate W. This is a swash glyph. And in this case, I didn't choose it because aesthetically I like this particular W more, but it just happens to pair more comfortably with this I because you don't get this negative space. So that's why I chose it. And this, by the way, is not from a real project that I've worked on, but I did have to use a similar tactic for a book that I designed once where two letter forms just weren't fitting together, so I pulled in a swash. And then finally, there is another issue here with the spacing between the lines that you might notice, which is that technically the space, the leading between all three of these lines is actually consistent. But because the word willows has this very tall piece in its, what would be called its horizon, the horizon of this word, there's this peak here. You can see there's like a lot of space here, but this is really tight. And so I think it sets a little bit awkwardly. So there are more than one solution, but one solution could be, for example, to make this smaller. It's less important. You could make it smaller, and by doing that, it's easier to kind of fudge the spacing around it to appear more optically consistent. You're just giving yourself more room to kind of tidy away the edges there. So that would be an example of how you would deal with spacing issues, and in particular, the spacing between pairs of lettering, which is again kerning. What I've done with the spacing here in between the lines is not kerning, but this here, for example, tightening up this HE, that's kerning. And of course, not to be confused with tracking, which is when you're adding consistent space throughout a word or a line. So, single pair of glyphs, kerning. So leading, I've already used that word a few times, so I think you're going to be comfortable with it. Oh, I've somehow managed to push my way back. Spacing and breaking. Okay, so other ways of breaking paragraphs, other than putting spacing between the paragraphs, are indenting the paragraph. So here's an indented paragraph, and there's, you'll notice, no space between them. You only want to choose one type of paragraph breaking. Don't pair them. So you could have a break, you could have an indent, and then this is a less common choice. Some people like it if they want to have a really clean, unbroken column of text, which you saw in the very first slide. And that is to use a glyph called a pilcrow, which indicates a paragraph break. It's essentially like having a little sign in your text that says this is a new paragraph instead of actually breaking it. So here, this is a pilcrow right here. This is another pilcrow right here. And I've put it in another color to help it stand out, to help it do its job. You don't have to do that, but that's an option. So these, again, are three different ways of breaking your paragraphs. And really importantly, you only use one. Don't double them up. There are a number of types of glyphs and strategies that you might use to kind of tailor your blocks of text to make it more comfortable. And I'm going to go through a few of them. So here at the top, you have a paragraph that's essentially untidied. It's just kind of raw text that I've dropped in. And this is text that I've gone in and begun to typeset. And so I'm going to point out some of the things that I've done. And I have highlighted those things in red, by the way, if you want to come back and not listen to me, but just look at what I've done. So the first thing is small caps. So small caps are letters that have the form of an uppercase letter, but they are smaller than cap height. So you can see here, these are small caps. Small caps are used in two places primarily. One is in place of type that's been set in uppercase for emphasis or for acronym. So for example, here the writer is got an uppercase when to make it seem louder. You might decide to leave it like that because you want it to feel really loud. If you don't want it to feel quite as loud, you could go in and set it in small caps, and that helps it flow with the rest of the text. You can see it's almost X height. It's just a bit higher than X height. And acronyms in particular, this can be useful for. So if you were typesetting a block of type that had a lot of mentions of an organization like UNICEF, for example, and you don't want it to feel like the text is shouting, small caps are excellent for that. If you use small caps, there are two things to be aware of. One is you want to avoid fake small caps, and this is something that we'll be talking about separately in class, and I will record a separate video showing how you typeset small caps, but you want to avoid using fake small caps, and you want to make use of additional glyphs that have been provided for you that are small caps in a font set. The second thing is that you very often will choose to track them out. So if you remember when I spoke earlier about tracking, to track out is to add more space between letters in a line of text or in a word. And so this has tracking. I've tracked it out. This is tracked out. So I haven't just set them in small caps. I've also tracked them out. And usually you do that. You don't have to if in your estimation that makes it look, for whatever reason, difficult to read, awkward, bad. You may choose not to do that. It's just very common. So that's small caps. Single and double primes and apostrophes. Okay, so this is actually a pretty important one, especially if you're producing work that you're wanting to show people in your portfolio. This is something that you want to have correct so that they know that you know how to set type. So here, what you see are certainly easy to read as apostrophes and single quotation marks, but they're actually something called a single prime. And let's see, I'm going to zoom in a little bit to help you see it. So it's a perfectly upright shape, and that's partly how you can tell that that's a single prime. A single prime actually has a specific meaning. It means feet. If I put a number in front of that, it would mean feet. And a double prime means inches. And that's not what you're intending to put here. So what you want to do is put proper apostrophes and quotation marks, and this is also true for double quotation marks. And you can see here, it's nice and curly. And if you're using a sans serif font, you'll see that it's at a slant. It might not have this curl to it, but it will have a slant to it. Okay, so you would go in and adjust those. There are two ways that you can adjust for replacing primes with apostrophes. One is that you can actually just pull the correct glyph out of your glyph palette in a program like InDesign. And the second thing that you can do is to go into your preferences and make sure that your typographer's quote marks are on. I believe it's called that. So you go in and make sure that you have that ticked off in your preferences. And at that point, any time you type in that glyph, if you hit the key that has the, right next to your return key on a Mac that has quotation marks and so on, they will come in the correct format. Another thing that you might need to put in are em dashes. So sometimes writers will use a double dash like this to separate out ideas. I find more and more writers are familiar with em dashes. They have more control because they're not working with typewriters anymore. They're working with computers. They have a lot more control. So you'll get more em dashes delivered to you by the writer. But at any rate, if somebody's just used a single dash or a double dash, you'll want to use the correct glyph, and I'll be talking about that more in a slide in a moment. But I would replace these with an em dash, and an em dash is its own glyph. And again, you can pull that out of the glyph palette or use a key command to achieve that. Another thing that you may choose to do if they're available to you are use alternates. So a moment ago I talked about an alternate swash W that was available in a set. Some fonts, especially older fonts or fonts that have the vernacular of an older time, will give you alternate glyphs to work with if you want to. So this would be an example of an alternate glyph for an E, and this is designed to be put at the end of a word. You could decide that you want to add that as essentially a decorative element. It doesn't have an additional meaning. These are some examples of alternate glyphs that come with this particular font. Another type of alternate glyphs would be these ligatures here. These are ligatures. A lot of these happen without you choosing them. If you type in the word fish, for example, in InDesign, quite often it will automatically replace your F and your I glyph with a single ligature like this. And then there are discretionary ligatures, which are called discretionary because they're not useful in the same way that an FI is useful. They're decorative, the same way that these glyphs are. And again, you might choose to use that decoratively. So I've put that in here. Now, just a little note here, if you are into working with alternate glyphs, use them sparingly. Think of them like jewelry or makeup or something. Some is nice. Well, I guess it's not my business. If people like to wear tons of makeup and jewelry, that can be nice too. But I'm just saying, like, you don't want to overdo it. And then finally, ornaments. Ornaments can be something that you use sort of at the very end of a paragraph to kind of round it out. You could put it at the, in between sections to kind of break up two big sections of type, however you want. But at any rate, there are ornaments that are available to you that will also be in your glyph palette. Not all fonts have them. I think when I have a font that I like, I do often take a look to see what ornaments are available because sometimes there are some really interesting ones. Okay, so these are more examples of the M, N, dash. So again, this is actually quite important if you're going to go into typesetting. So M dashes, EM dashes, are used when you want to separate out pieces of information for one another. So if you have an aside in the middle of a sentence, you would separate that out with an M dash. It's acceptable to put spaces, it's acceptable to put spaces on both sides of an M dash, or to not put spaces on both sides of an M dash. And the two important things are, firstly, that you're consistent. So whichever style you choose, space or no space, you're consistent. And secondly, this is something that copy editors or editors often have quite strong opinions about. And so if I'm typesetting for a client, I'll ask them if they have a preference. It's not the type of thing that I personally have a strong feeling about, so I'll do what they prefer. Just one last note. This is one of the few parts of blocks of text that you may need to go in and kern. Some fonts, the M dash will set a little bit loose on one side or tight on one side, and you might need to go through a text, find all of the M dashes and kern it. An N dash, an EN dash, is to separate out ranges of numbers. So you might use it if you had pages, page 16 to 17, you would use an N dash here. In the case of dates, you would use that. So this is just a dash. This is just a hyphen. And this is an N dash. And again, you'd have to either use a key command or use the glyph palette in order to get that glyph. This is another example of an N dash being correctly used. However, don't get the idea that hyphens are therefore always to be replaced, because they have their own meaning. So a hyphen bridges words together, it holds words together. So if there's a hyphenate name like this, you would appropriately use a hyphen here. You wouldn't replace it with a dash. Similarly, if you have a line of type and there's a word that breaks at the end of it, you use a hyphen to show that that break has occurred and not one of these longer dashes. The other thing that is in this text here is text figures. Text figures are also known as old style figures, or you might have some fonts that have a set that's marked OSF that also would stand for text figures. Sorry, old style figures. I find text figures is the easiest one to remember because it helps remind you what the purpose of them is. So when you're working with most fonts, if you type in numbers, they come out looking like this, in which case they're more or less cap height, they're tall, and they're consistently tall and tend to sit on the same baseline. So these would be standard numerals. These can be referred to as lining figures or tabular figures, and they're good for let's say I was doing an annual report and there were a lot of numbers and I wanted people to be able to comfortably scan through those numbers, or if I was tabulating a receipt. Those are places where this type of numeral is more comfortable to scan because it stands out from the text. If I want the numerals to flow with the text, then what I might do is choose text figures. And you can see here what's happening is that, first of all, the text figures more or less conform to X height, so they don't stand out from the text in the same way. And secondly, they do something called bouncing on the baseline. They're dipping below the baseline. Some of them are essentially behaving as if they were a letter form with an ascender. And because they have that kind of rumpled quality to them, that kind of uneven quality to them, it helps them blend into the text. And that's why I find it's easier to remember text figures rather than old style figures, but both terms are used. So the thing about choosing between lining figures and like this and old style figures or text figures is that the only rule is that you need to be consistent. It's not the same as working with dashes, in which case each type of hyphen and dash has a particular meaning attached to it. It's a more stylistic choice. So if you decide you want to work with text figures, the key thing is that you have to be consistent and use them throughout the text. So this is correct. What you see right here, this is correct. And this is equally correct. They are both ranges of numbers that have end dashes in between them. Similarly, both of these are correct as well. So this is something that as a designer I will make a choice on. I will decide whether or not I think text figures or lining figures are more appropriate. But if you're working with a copy editor or an editor that has a really strong opinion, they will override you for the most part. Their decision will, likely take precedent. It depends on your relationship with them. From time to time, I've worked with people who are not familiar with these, and they think I'm making kind of a stylistic choice. But actually, it's a convention, and the numerals always fall in the same places. In other words, the 9 will always dip below the baseline. The 6 will always go up like this. It's consistent. It's not a sort of stylistic choice that the font designer or you is making. So again, here we have another block of text, and this is correct, and this is correct. They're both fine. Column width is something that is a really important early decision that you make when you're laying out blocks of text. These are very narrow columns, right? And this is a very long one. So one thing to be careful of is that your columns are not too narrow or too wide. So a column that's very narrow is good for scanning. You'll notice that newspapers, for example, which they're still around, newspapers, I'm going to need a new example soon, but newspapers will use this for type for text because they want you to be able to scan through stories quickly. And the other thing that very narrow columns do is they actually speed you up. You actually read at a faster pace. So the rhythm of your reading is sped up. It's more exciting. And if you have a long line, it slows you down. So rather than a newspaper, if you think about a novel or a book that you've read, usually there are longer lines of type. It's unusual in a book to have narrow columns of type because the idea is to let you be contemplative as you're reading. Now, if you have a column that's too narrow, it can be actually annoying. And if you have a line that's too long, it can be actually really impossible to read. There's a certain point at which your eye starts to forget where it started and will just get lost on the page. So my general way of managing it is that I tend to not go more than 12 to 14 words per line as a rule. I have seen some variation on that. That's not like a universal standard. I would say 12 to 14 lines is probably your maximum in English. And the other important thing to mention here, and this is really important for people who are in my introduction to type class, there's a handful of errors I really don't want you to make, and this is one of them. If you have a narrow column like this, you can't try and justify it. We'll talk about this more in a subsequent slide, but you'll see that all these lines are lined up here, and they're also equally lined up here. And this column is very uneven. Some people find this type of unevenness to look messy, and so they will straighten up both sides in order to compensate for that. However, if you have a narrow column of type and you want both sides to line up with each other, the only way that the software can do that is by having these very, very big gaps in between the words. And it creates a negative space that can create a kind of like little white negative space shape that we call rivers. And it's very bad. That's a mistake. It's not a choice, it's a mistake. So if you really want to have sort of very lined up rectangular blocks of type in which you have two straight lines on either side, then you'll need to have a longer line length so that you're not seeing the rivers. So you want to make it wide enough that you don't get rivers, but short enough that you're not going above, 12 to 14 words per line. So part of your early typesetting will be trying to get that figured out. Even if you do decide to choose to have, an unevenness to your column, to your text block here, which again, I haven't, introduced it yet, but this would be like a ragged column as opposed to being justified. None of these are justified. They're all have this uneven rag. You'll still need to go in and do a little bit of tidying up. So things that you would tidy up in a column. First of all, if you're looking at a column of type and it's got a lot of these really big jagged shapes, sometimes just making the column a tiny bit wider or a tiny bit narrower, you'll find you get a more evenly distributed line length that looks a bit more comfortable. So this block of type, for example, is just the tiniest bit narrower than this, but this sets more comfortably. So the first thing to do is just to kind of like optically play around with your column width to see if you can get something a bit more comfortable. And the second thing is to go in and make sure you don't have what are called bad breaks. So for example, this here, badger here is not a noun, it's the name of the character. The character is called Badger, the same way I'm called Robin. So you can't break proper nouns. You can't break somebody's name. So you would need to use your tracking to pull this together. So one thing that you might do is track negatively this line here and see if you can pop the ER up onto the same line. If you start tracking too much and it looks really tight, that's not going to work. And then you'll have to go back and try something else. But that would be something that you would work on, and that would be usually the first thing I would try to do. This is another set of bad breaks. So the reason these are bad breaks is that you don't want to stack more than 2 breaks on top of each other. So if you have 3 breaks like this, it's too many, and you're going to have to go in and again tidy it up. This here also is a bad break because you don't want to break before 2 letters or less. So you would go in, and again, you probably would just tighten this up a little bit and see if you can pull the ES up. The other thing about breaking is that you need to break between syllables. So if you're ever not sure where you are allowed to put a hyphen to break a word, like let's say you decide you need to break a word, like you needed to break the word central to make something else work, that happens sometimes. You can just look up in a dictionary, look the word up and see where the dictionary breaks it, and then you can break it there. Okay, and then the last thing that's on this column is, got a message. Okay, is a widow. So widow is something that you might have heard about. A widow would be a single word at the end of a paragraph. Now, if you have a really long word at the end of a paragraph, sometimes that could be okay. And I'm backed up in saying this by a very famous type guy named Jan Schichold. So I stand by that. However, if you can avoid having a widow, you want to. So you might go in again and track in this text and just see if you can pop that word up. So you might need to track in a little bit more. And again, your tracking should not be too tight. If you're getting to like -20, -25, you're getting into the danger zone, I think. Other designers might have a slightly different barometer there. But you try to get rid of the widow if you can. Oh, I have the word stacking here, and just in case I didn't say it, this would be the stacking of the 3 breaks. Okay, so those would be some choices that you might make to tidy up the text a little bit. When we talk about the color of type, we're referring to the weight or heaviness of a font. Sometimes if you have a really heavy font, it might be like a darker color. It also could refer to how it's set. So if you just kind of squint your eyes and look at these 2 blocks of type, they have the same type size and the font is the same weight, but this looks darker on the page because it's tighter. So if you want to adjust the color and make something lighter, you could make it, you could track it out a bit, although be careful of tracking type out too much because you'll destroy the shape. This, for example, I think is a bit loose. And you could add in a bit more leading. And again, as with anything, if you have a little bit of extra leading, it could be more comfortable. There is a certain point at which the leading will become too loose and it will give your eye too much work to travel to find the next line. So you want to try and get a happy medium. I would say this is a bit tight and this is a bit loose. Working with justified text. So before we were talking about working with ragged text, this is justified text, and justified text means that, as I mentioned, all of these lines start at the same point and they all end at the same point. Forced justified text is when even the last line spans the width of the column, and it's really difficult to work with. I don't recommend it unless you're willing to do a certain amount of work and you have some control over the text itself. In other words, you can add or take away text if you need to. So this is justified text. And again, the width of that text is going to make a big difference if you add just a tiny bit of width, it's going to change where certain items are breaking. So you can see here, this is a little bit wide for the number of words per line. So you can see that some lines have like a lot of spacing between them. If you remember what we were talking about before, that means that it's not very comfortable. It's almost like the type is wearing pants that are like a little bit too loose. So you need to tighten it up a little bit. This is better, so that the space between the words is more comfortable. Neither of these is perfect, to be honest. I'm just trying to show you what happens when you make something a little bit looser or tighter. So again, if you're working with justified text, you'll have to spend a little bit of time making sure that you've proportioned your columns correctly, and you may need to go back in and tweak them. You may need to go and choose a line, select it, and track it out a little bit. Again, positive 20 or negative 20 tracking, starting to get into the danger zone. Going forward or backwards for some reason. Okay, so hierarchy and working with initials. So hierarchy has to do with organizing text on the page so that some pieces of text are more prominent or are read first or are seen as a key point on the page that you look at first. So one way to achieve hierarchy very simply is just to place type above other type right away. That creates some hierarchy. Putting space around it, that could add to your hierarchy. You might choose to set a type like a title. In this case, this would be a chapter title. You might choose to set it in another font. So this is set in a sans serif. It's different from the text of the body text. Or you could put it in small caps. These are small caps. Those would be ways in which you could help to separate it out. Working with an initial is different than working with a drop cap. An initial sits on the same baseline as the rest of the text, but in some way it stands out. And so I'm going to show you, or I'm showing you here, two different approaches to that. In this case here, this is a third font. So this is a font, and this is a font, a second font, and this is a third font. And this is designed to be a little bit different from the rest of the text and stand out. And it's set bigger than the rest of the text. And if I was, this is not a real project, I just put it together for this recording, but one of the things I would probably try to do is make some of these lighter areas feel consistently weighted with the text in the paragraph. Not perfectly consistently weighted, but that's something that I would look at, trying to balance out the weight of them together. Anyway, that's an option. In this case here, I've used a letter form, a glyph, that's the same font, but bigger, and you might have realized that this is a swash K, so it has this really unusual leg that almost looks like a tail here. So if you wanted to do something like this, one of the things that you need to do is think about adjusting the text around it. So if you see here, if I was to hang that K out, I might need to make sure that it's not going to crash into the H here. I might need to adjust my width here. You can see actually that this is a tiny bit loose. If you want to critique what I have in front of me, this is a tiny bit loose, so maybe I wouldn't be quite done with this. But at any rate, I would go in and I would do some tracking in and out around this to get this K to sit comfortably with this type that it's potentially going to be butting right up against. Yeah, so those are some examples of creating hierarchy and working with alternate fonts. It's very common to have a sans serif font as display type and serif type as body type, and that's because in Roman orthography we read by word shape, so this is considered to be more readable, and this is considered, to be more for display. It's not a rule, you don't have to do it, but that's why that convention is there. Drop caps are different than initials because they, as they sound like, they drop into the text itself. So one thing about drop caps, this is just actually kind of like something that's a tiny bit of a pet peeve to me, is you just want to make sure that you're not going to have a word here that looks like it attaches to the K. So again, this is actually not perfect. This is a real B- situation. This is too loose, but anyway, the way that you achieve a drop cap is in the paragraph settings as well, and I will put that in the the other video that has a mini InDesign tutorial on some of these choices that I'm making, how to do them. Okay, so I'm going to end this here, and then I will record a very short video that shows you how to set up paragraph breaks in InDesign, how to set up a drop cap, and how to put in alternate glyphs, M dashes and N dashes, proper quotation marks, to help you through those. It may be that you already know how to do them, and if you do, you don't need to watch that. But okay, so thank you for your time and attention, and I wish you good typesetting.